the progression of technology, right? The infrastructure that we use has become more and more important, right? And workload automation has changed from being just a back-end function to play a critical role in our infrastructure, right? It's today responsible for operational efficiency, compliance, digital transformation, reliability, scalability, and basically it is responsible for automation across the whole business, right? So what is important when we are trying to convert from a legacy platform, right?
All right, so we do have a poll that we're going to do really quickly. So the first poll is, what is the biggest challenges you're facing with your workload automation tool? One, lack of proper support, lack of functionality that allows you to grow your footprint without needing of additional tools, or cost. So let's give it just another second. All right, we are going to close the poll. All right, it looks like there's a tie between lack of functionality and cost.
Yes, so that's interesting but expected, right? So we are seeing that with the change of technology and the shift to the cloud, many of the tools cannot handle both at the same time, and of course, cost is also a factor in these tools, right? These enterprise tools. So, given the importance that we see with the workload automation in the enterprise, right? Managing risk on a transition project becomes very important, right? So we need to ensure that there is no disruption to the business when we are doing this process, right? And the workload automation tool is ingrained in all your processes, right? From data integrity and security to compliance and regulatory requirements. And of course, when you manage cost, right? Cost goes across everything, not only the cost of your tool, right? So you can minimize cost if you increase the automation and if the steps you have to take are not as many as you had before. So operating across all these dimensions of the business will ensure business continuity. And as a project of replacing your workload transition software is not a simple project. It requires a lot of investment, right? Investment in the license of the new tool, investment in the project itself, contracting whoever is going to do the transition for you, as well as investing in internal resources, right? So this is not going to be a straightforward and simple project. So we need to ensure the return on investment, right? Managing risks in these scenarios become very important. And we need to anticipate what may happen in the transition so that we can be prepared for it. It's inevitable that we are going to face some challenges during the transition of a legacy platform. We just need to be prepared for it.
We have one more poll question. Let's go ahead and publish it. So what do you consider the most important aspect of conversion project in your organization? Is it avoiding risk, making sure your vendor provides you most of the work with little involvement from internal teams, or other? So let's give it just another second for everyone to answer the poll. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close it. So it looks like 64% said avoiding risks.
Yeah, so really expected, right? Given the intertwined nature of a workload automation in the current IT infrastructure, it's very important to avoid risk because you can disrupt the business operation. And this may mean a lot of losses for the business, right? So let's see how at Stonebranch we manage those risks and control anything that can happen during the transition process, right? So internally at Stonebranch, we developed a 7-step methodology that allows us to structure the project and prepare the mechanisms that will allow us to understand the problems that we may face very early on in the process so that we can address them. So the first step on this process is what we call discovery and analysis. At that step, we will understand how our customer is going to use the workload automation software. So we understand the resources that are involved, both human resources and uh, other types of resources, such as data sources, third-party applications, and other applications that the workload automation tool will have to interface with. We also do a discussion with the customer about the life cycle of the job, right? Our tool allows us to treat this as a software development cycle. So we can develop our workload in a development environment, move it to a quality assurance environment, and finally move it to production. There are specific functionalities in UAC that allow it to push this automatically across environments, right? And that facilitates a lot the usage of the workload automation tool. But we need to make sure that if this is not the model that is in place, that we transition it appropriately and take the right steps to make it the different process, right? The different life cycle process for the jobs. The next step is initiation and setup. So at this point, we will stand up the infrastructure. So we will install the application on the designated servers, and we will prepare the documents that will allow us to carry out the governance of the project. So at this point, we will prepare a communications plan, identifying the main players of the project. We will prepare a kickoff deck, and this kickoff will be a brief description of the project to the broader organization, right? Typically, a workload automation software will involve multiple applications that one way or another will have to interact with the project. So we would like everyone in the organization that has some involvement with the workload automation transition project to be informed about what's happening, right? And we obviously prepare a project plan. The project plan will have all the steps that will be taken with the responsible parties and will be the main instrument that we'll be using to gauge if we are on track with the delivery of the project. Once that is set up, we go into training. So training is somewhat of a floating activity during this process. We can delay training somewhat, but we want you to be familiar with the tool and how to operate it before we deliver the transition into your environment. So there is some flexibility, but it needs to be done before the transition is finished. The workload transition is the main step of the conversion process, and it is comprised of two steps, right? The first one is an automatic conversion. We have a tool that we feed an extract from the legacy platform, and it will generate the objects that we need in UAC. Because this process is not perfect, there are what we call exceptions, right? This tool will produce the objects for UAC, but also a report with all the scenarios and the objects and the data that it did not understand. So our engineers will have to go through these individual exceptions and understand what what is wrong, right, with the extract, with the object, and what needs to be changed. The changes that are made here can vary in a wide range, right? We use some alternative tools. We have scripts that are executed, sometimes pre-transition, right? We process the data before we submit it to the automated tool, and sometimes after the conversion, right? We use API tools, we use database tools. So a lot of different tools are used, but we call this secondary process of the workload transition a manual process because it always needs to be driven by our engineer. So once these two steps are done, the main conversion is done. And then we go into what we call the cycle of validation and cutover. Typically, for large workloads, it's very difficult for us to approach this in a big bang approach, right? By simply turning off the legacy platform and turning on the new platform. This will increase risk significantly. And to avoid that, we break things into several different waves, as we call them, right? But they are nothing but more than different phases into production. And these phases will apply to validation and go live and cutover. They do not apply to transition, right? So transition needs to be done in a single block, in a single phase. These different validation phases have been identified in the second step of our methodology here when we put together the project plan. At that time, we already grouped the different jobs that will be validated and pushed to production together. So once the workload is delivered to a lower environment in the customer infrastructure, and by lower environment, I mean either a development environment or a QA environment, they can start validation. Once the workload set is validated, it can be moved into production, and those jobs can be turned off in your legacy platform. Of course, these two steps of our methodology will be repeated as many times as the sets that we defined in the setup of the project, right, in our project plan. Once we are finished with those steps, we go into what we call optimization, right? So the main goal of our transition is to acquire the workflows that were in the legacy platform, but do not change them significantly, right? We will try to keep them the same way they were in the legacy platform. This is to facilitate operation after the conversion. This may not be the best way of configuring the particular scenario in the new tool, right? This is a different tool, it has different functionality, and there may be a more efficient way of doing that rather than the way it was converted. So we will review, our engineers will sit down with the workload automation engineers of the customer to review those cases and explain the benefits of doing things differently, right? And these benefits can range from less consumption of resources, easier to write workflows, more control over the workloads that are executing, less time of execution. All of these things can be presented during the best practices review. There will be no need for you to change what was converted. The system will work as converted, but going forward, as you start to use the tool yourself and writing new workflows, it is important that you observe that so that you can take the best out of the tool. Okay, so on all these phases, how are the responsibilities that are split between the customer and Stonebranch, right? Stonebranch, this methodology is front-loaded, right? Which means Stonebranch is going to have a lot more activities and work to be done in the first 4 phases of the methodology, of our process, right? With workload transition being the largest by far. After that, the work shifts to the customer, where during validation and cutover, which is nothing more than a user acceptance test, they will be busier than Stonebranch. The customers will be busier. And finally, when we get into the optimization, I think both teams will be engaged at the same amount. It's important to note here that what we are calling workload validation is the execution of the test plan, right? While the Stonebranch is doing the conversion itself, the customer should be working on planning the validation, because as we will see shortly, validation is not a straightforward activity, right? So it needs some thinking. Environments may be different. You may not have the same connections in lower environments as you have in production. So devising a strategy to validate your workloads is very important and will allow you and prevent a lot of headaches during the project. So how does it look, a typical project plan, right? A typical workload breakdown structure. So the weeks here are just an example, right? They do not map to any specific length of a project, right? But it shows that the activities that Stonebranch executes are in the very beginning of the process, while the validation are in the last phase of it, right? These two groups of activities in the project are more or less consuming 40% of the total project time for the first 4 steps of the methodology, and 60% of the total project time for the last phases of it, the 3 last phases. This is just a rule of the thumb. It's nothing that can be applied across the board without some judgment into the proper scenario, right? And in the day and age of Agile, right, we show a very waterfall-like process, right? Why is that? So workload transition is very difficult, right? Separating the sets that can be validated independently is a very difficult task because of the interdependencies among the jobs that are in the different groups of jobs that we identify. So for instance, we have jobs in wave 1 that depend on jobs on wave 2. And because these groups are not mutually exclusive, doing the transition in one single step is very difficult, right? That's why this looks like more of a waterfall approach rather than an iterative approach. Okay, so what are the main problems that we find when we transition this project, right? Of course, this is a generic methodology, and the criteria, the rigor at which we impose any of the mechanisms that we define are determined by the size of the project, right? The larger the project, the more rigor we have to have managing the project. Otherwise, we will increase its risks, right? But typically, we have 3 categories of risks that we try to manage. We have managerial risks, technical risks, and organizational risks. And they are, some of them, not all of them, of course, are represented in this graph on the right. The graph shows the probability of that risk happening on the y-axis here in the vertical. And we have the impact on the project if that risk happens. So at the very top here of the probability, and with a medium to high impact on your project, is not preparing for validation phase. So you cannot wait until the validation phase for you to start working on what you're going to do. You need to prepare ahead of time. And that involves a series of concepts that you need to understand dependencies across applications, dependencies across multiple workflows, understanding how you are going to validate each one of these workflows and jobs that you have in each set. Another important one here is no support from all areas of the organization. As we said in the very beginning, this a project of this magnitude involves the IT infrastructure of the whole company, right? And it's very likely that you will need other people from other departments. These other departments need to be on board of the project so that whenever there is a need for those resources to be engaged, they can be brought into the project very quickly. So a couple of examples of this, right? You will need sysadmins to control the privileges of the different credentials in your infrastructure. You will need network engineers because we are changing servers, we are changing, depends on exactly how you are changing. You may be changing addresses and network paths that need to be configured in firewalls, in load balancers and other IT devices. You may need a DBA to help you with the installation of the UAC product, but also to make the other databases available to the different jobs that will be migrated. You need SMEs, right? Subject matter experts for the workload automation and for the applications that are being automated through the system. So it's really a project that will impact the teams as a whole, right? So if you have a very large organization, it is very important that you engage these people up front, that they know what you're doing, that they know what is your need for their participation in the project. And it's also sometimes, depending on size, of course, important to engage the management of these teams, because they are the ones that can expedite and decide on priority should a conflict arise, right? And there is always going to be a conflict. This is a spike in the workload of any organization, so conflicts are much likely to arise, right? An interesting risk here is third-party engagements, right? So it has a high impact, not very high probability, because we try to anticipate ourselves to identifying those cases. But if you have a third-party company that manages part of your infrastructure in a managed service contract, or even on a completely outsourced engagement, such as mainframes, right? This is very typical with companies that run mainframes, that the mainframes are managed and run by a third-party company. If we need to do some work on those mainframes, sometimes the work that needs to be done is not part of the current contract that you have. And if you find that out only when you need their engagement, you are late, right? And the team that is working on your workload transition is going to be waiting until they are done with their changes, right? So it is very important to identify the third-party dependencies very early on in the project when we are doing planning. And while we are doing planning, we can anticipate and negotiate those things. Another curious thing here is inaccurate schedules and estimates, right? As we are going to see, it is very important for us to be realistic about the timeline of the project, right? At times, in order to make the business plan, as I mentioned in the very beginning, to work, the timeline is already compromised, right? We have a deadline when the renewal of the contract is coming, and we need to replace before the renewal so that the business plan makes sense. If we go for an unrealistic timeline, this is a major problem for the project, right? We may run into trouble and not be able to convert within the allotted time. Well, there are other risks here that are less important, and certainly many more that I haven't listed here. I just listed the more common ones, right? So how does our methodology address these risks, right? So we address the organizational risk mitigation by engaging most of the stakeholders that are necessary for our project to be successful, right? It is very important to have leadership engagement, and sometimes we always recommend the creation of a steering committee, but also at times, if the project is large enough, the creation of an operational committee, which is an intermediate committee between the project team and the steering committee that can clear up these conflicts that will arise during the project. Managerial risks are managed through the methodology itself, right, and the rigor with which we apply it. So the idea is that we will have a more detailed project plan, and we'll have more tasks and monitor those tasks to execution, the more complex the project is. And when we say that this is a methodology and this is the project and how Stonebranch conducts the project, well, the project itself is a partnership between us and the customer, right? So both of them own the project, and we need to work in synchrony to be able to make it happen and to avoid the risks that surface. And of course, there are technical risks that surface, right? Stonebranch has a very long experience from converting from legacy platforms, and we have never faced a problem that we were not able to address with the customer. So we are migrating from a different system. So certainly there will be cases where the functionalities don't match, and we need to sit down and see how that business function can be implemented in the new platform. But we've been able to address this 100% of the time. So the secret to mitigate the risk is determining the rigor with which we monitor the project and we progress with it.
All right, we have another poll question. So replacing your workload automation tool, what key challenges do you anticipate? Selecting an appropriate tool.
Yep.
Sorry, can you hear me?
I can hear you, but I think this is not the right question. Sorry.
Sorry. Well, we can go ahead and finish this one and then we'll close it out. Selecting the appropriate tool, making sure you can trust the process for migrating from one tool to another, or making sure you have the bandwidth for your internal team to do the necessary work. All right, let's go ahead and close it. All right, looks like 45% said making sure you can trust the process for migrating from one tool to another. Sorry about that, Paulo.
That's okay. So it's reducing risk is important, right? But we also understand that many companies, as I said before, right, there is a spike in the workload of the teams involved with the workload automation tool, right? So at times, adjusting the workload that will be assigned to the internal teams is a very important aspect of the transition process. If you do not have the internal people to work on the tasks that are assigned to you in the process, this is going to become a problem in the the project overall, right? And when we are talking about medium to large size conversions, we are talking projects that will range from 6 months to 2 years. And it's a long time for you to have different teams under stress, under a high workload, right? So sometimes it's important to not only uh, work with the transition itself, but also understanding the internal tasks that will come. Okay, so is it all about risk? Not really, right? There are lots of different other activities that you will need to carry out. So one of them is estimating the internal effort, right? You need to understand what types of roles you are going to engage with, how much of each one of the profiles you need engaged. And this can be more or less depending on how your internal workload automation tool is structured, right? Some companies will have a full team that implements the workflows and manages the operation of the tool. Other companies will have the design and implementation of the workflows delegated to the application teams and have only an operational team that runs the tool in production. So all these needs to be taken into account. And also, this needs to be taken into account while planning for the project, because if you split the jobs, the groups of jobs, in such a way that the same application is engaged in 5 of your different waves, you are going to keep that application team engaged for the whole time, right? Whereas if you concentrate all the jobs of a different application in a single wave, you can concentrate the impact to a certain application to that particular wave, right? So there is a lot to do in estimating the internal effort here. As I mentioned before, validation is key, right? I think that at least 50% of the success of the project is based on you having a clear strategy for validating your workloads. And because this is expensive, as I just mentioned, it's important to think what you really need to validate fully and what can be validated with less rigor. Validation is a complete other topic, and but it requires a lot of attention, right, and thinking. And as I mentioned again about the estimates and the timeline proposal for the project, right? We need to be realistic, right? Not being realistic will cause problems along the way, right? We believe we can do something and the problems will delay us and we'll end up not meeting the expectation. I think this is basically what I had to say today, and I think we're going to open up for questions, right, Lauren?
Okay, so I did ask where everyone is calling in from. So it looks like we have some people calling in from Canada, South Florida, Frankfurt, Germany, Barcelona. So great. I'm glad that we have lots of global audience. All right. So sorry, one second. My computer's being slow. Okay. Let me share this on stage. How do you estimate the internal necessary effort?
Okay, very good question. So we need to take into consideration several aspects of this. If you have the your organization of the workload automation delegated to the applications, you need some time from the applications. And this will be based on the complexity of the jobs, You also need to engage the other participants. There is no single answer that will give you a number for these internal efforts. You need to approach this through several different mechanisms. One of the handouts that we are offering today explains this in detail, and there are several mechanisms you can use. If you have done a conversion before, that is a very good milestone for you to consider while estimating the new project, right? You can base your new conversion based off of the previous conversion that you have done, and of course, try to derive a certain number of hours or man days per job and multiply by how much the company workload has grown, right? It's not straightforward, and it requires a dedicated effort trying to analyze and understand all the impact that you are going to have. The handout is a very good way to understand that.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
So yes, you can, in the little handout resources, we have a couple things you can download and read through. All right, the next question is, what type of people resource system engineers, data engineers, and network engineers?
Yeah, so you need network engineers, sysadmins, database administrators, SMEs on the workload that you are transitioning. This may be the workload automation team or the application teams, whoever is writing your workloads. And finally, the operation team of the workload automation, right? Uh, you These are direct involved with the project. You may need testers, right, that are going to validate the workload that was transitioned. So the user acceptance test may be done by a third party, but it's going to be very difficult for it to be done by a third party without involvement of the SMEs. They are the ones that know their workload and can answer questions about the functionality that existed before, right? And therefore, what is going to be measured in the new system, right? There will probably be additional roles involved, those that are related to cloud, if you have any type of cloud integration. So a cloud engineer will probably be needed, and the management of all these departments, right?
Okay, great. Next question. What is the most difficult part of the transition process?
Yeah, that is a difficult one. It's a good question, but it's a difficult one. Depends on the perspective, right? So converting from legacy platforms, the transition itself can be complex and challenging depending on the legacy platform that you're converting from. But from a customer perspective, certainly validation is the most challenging phase of the process because they have to prepare for something that is not typical. It doesn't happen all the time, and it may look like simply testing software. It's a little different, right? Because you do not have a clear requirements document. You don't have environments to execute this against. So you will need to think out of the box to carry out validation. So from a customer perspective, definitely validation is the most challenging phase of the project.
All right. Next question. How does Stonebranch handle changes to jobs that occurred during the migration process, automation and UAC in real time?
Very good question. So depends on several factors, right? So the first thing that we ask the customer is the rate of change that happens into their workloads. if changes are not that significant compared to the timeline of the project, those changes are managed manually. And it's a very good way for the customer to start getting familiar with the tool. So they implement the new functionality again in the tool, but they still have our engineers assigned to the project that can help with an on-the-job training, so to speak, right? But if those changes are massive in volume, then it becomes very difficult to require them to be implemented manually. So on some legacy platforms, we can reprocess the extract and save some time by implementing this in UAC before the cutover. On some other platforms, it's going to be brute force, right? We need to have a team prepared to take on these changes and start to implement them in UAC before the cutover. Of course, if we need to understand this very early on in the project, because we need to plan for it, right? So if this is going to be a problem and there is a lot of changes, it's probably a good advice to have more waves in the process so that the changes are not that massive.
Okay, great. Next question. How can you make sure that you have enough performance after the migration?
Very good. So UAC is a distributed platform, and because the workload is performed most of the time on the agents, yes, there are some jobs that are triggered and executed in the controller, but the majority of them are executed in agents. So the system is very good at distributing load. There are some concerns in the performance that we have to address early on in the process. And we need also to understand the shift that exists between moving from a mainframe-based platform into a distributed platform, right? Some of the things that are done in some legacy platforms are not necessary in UAC, like having a plan for the day, an execution plan for the day, and triggering jobs all at the same time. So these things can impact the performance of the system, but they are all things that can be caught during the transition and during the planning and testing of the tool. So I think addressing the system performs, right? So we have this installed and processing millions of jobs per unit of time, right? So depending on the size of the server, this can be millions of executions a day, million executions a month, a week, right? So we do have customers running very heavy workloads, and the performance is not a problem. But we need to tune everything to the performance, right? We need to tune the system capacity, memory, database, as well as the way we trigger the workload.
Great. Next question. How can we prepare in advance for a workload automation replacement project?
Yeah, this is a very good question, right? I think the best thing that you can do to prepare is to do any cleanups that you need to do in your workload before the transition, right? Once you decide to replace your workload tool, you will not have time to do the cleanup, and we cannot ignore jobs that are present in the extract because of the dependencies, right? So some legacy platforms allow you to disable jobs but keep them there, and that does not do good for the transition, right? So in some cases we can isolate those jobs, but in others we cannot. So the best thing you can do is to understand your workload and clean it up before you start the project. Do we have any other questions, Laurie?
Okay. Sorry. Um, have you migrated from IBM workload scheduler?
Yes, we did. And we were very successful. We have several projects in which we converted from IBM, and we were very successful.
Sorry, I'm gonna turn my camera off because my Wi-Fi is not working properly. Sorry, are you ready for the next question?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Can you please shed some light on real use cases that have helped clients, mainly in migration and downtime taken? My interest is in realistic case studies that you might have.
We can, yes, I didn't prepare a slide on case studies, but I can give you a couple of examples. We converted, so when you say downtime, right? Downtime is, it should be almost nothing, right? We plan the transition and the downtime should be minimum. The time to deploy on that particular wave and then turn off the legacy platform. We converted workloads of 280,000 jobs in a timeline that was 14 months. This was a very structured project where we had our partner, the customer, had a very structured project management team, and the management was all engaged, and they have cleared all the roadblocks. They were determined to make that happen in the short time we had. This is an extreme case. Converting these many jobs is not a walk in the park. There is a lot of work to be done on both sides, on the conversion side and on the customer side, validating those jobs. So that was a very successful one. Of course, we have challenges with customers when the customer doesn't engage with the same rigor, right? And therefore, we need to address the risks in a different way. We need to address things as they come. And if I didn't answer your question in full, you can reach out to us and we can have a sidebar discussion on this in more detail. I can give you more details.
Okay, we covered this some with the IBM one, but have you migrated from UC4 jobs, JCL scripts to UAC? Can you share some examples of how the strategy for proprietary scripts to UAC?
Yes, very good question. So UC4 has a mechanism to write scripts, and the more you use it, the more you're tied to the tool, right? Converting those scripts is no walk in the park. We have developed internally two tools. One tool that allows us to gauge the complexity of those scripts. So before we start any conversion, we can tell you how bad it's going to be to convert those scripts. So many of those scripts we separate into groups, so groups that we can map directly into functionalities of UAC, and others that will need some extra architecting, right? Those cases we'll have to sit down with the customer and understand the business function to rewrite it with objects from UAC. We have been successful applying that approach into converting large UC4 customers.
Great. Here's another one. How do you analyze the existing dependencies in jobs, resources, etc.? Any proven methods you may already have?
Yes, we have done this in different ways, right? One way that we did this is converting it first. We submit the conversion in the workload through our conversion process, and we have a dependency report that lists all the dependencies. But a report is probably not the best tool to visualize this. So we also created a visualization tool that can plot the graph of dependencies and allow you to show where the clusters are, right? So what are the probable clusters that would make for a good technical breakdown of the jobs into multiple groups? And I say technical breakdown because if you have, as I mentioned before, right, for us, technical trying to convert this, the easiest way to do is if we can find mutually exclusive groups that we can convert one at a time, right? But it's very unlikely that we are going to find this because these mutually exclusive groups will impose a dependency on the applications outside of the workload, right? And this will mean that we have to engage, for instance, the HR team across all the phases of the project, which is probably not what the HR department would like to have. So yes, we have tools that allow you to visualize this and find the independent sets or the least dependency groups, but sometimes the approach is not the technical one. It's more that of the operation of the business.
All right. Some of the questions we might need to follow up with separately. There's a little bit more detail in them. So if we didn't get to your question today, we will follow up by email and go into a little bit more detail with that. Paulo, thank you so much for the presentation. It was wonderful, very helpful. Later today, you will receive an email that contains a link to the recording so that you can rewatch or share with colleagues. Keep an eye out for our upcoming webinars. We will have the UAC 7.8 release and the State of IT Automation webinars. So you can check out Stonebranch events or check your email for registration information. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and we will see you at our next session.
Thank you all.